baseline level. And they were no longer required to deal with teaching to the student that really knew nothing, even in a room of 30 people. So if today there was one person that was well behind everybody else, it would bring down the whole course. And so for 5 days or 10 days, we'd be teaching at a much lower level than we should be. With e-learning and testing, that person wouldn't be able to be in the classroom unless they passed the test and they established a certain level of proficiency. And then the last 1 or 2 days would be post-training to evaluate whether or not somebody was effective and to do reminders. And that training might not be the next day. It might be 30, 60, 90 days later to reinforce the training that happened after the fact and really try to impact behavior. And so you had this big shift. We found that our clients in their e-learning libraries had a 70-30 split, but it often varied. Either 70% or 30% would be third-party content. It depended predominantly on the type of company. And what I mean by that was off-the-shelf content that was easily reusable from a third party. And that's part of those 30,000 titles that we have. The other component would be proprietary content. So either 30% or 70%, depending on the type of company, would have custom-built e-learning, where it was predominantly about their processes, their products, their services, and was not something that was universal. It was something that had to be specific. Now, the mistake that a lot of these companies made over time was because they were buying directly from the content providers, they were often buying at a business unit level. So each business unit would buy leadership training or customer service training from an e-learning vendor, but they do it independently. Now, the problem with that was, of course, no economies of scale. So the company would get no volume discount from the provider. Each deal was done independently. The benefit of a global LMS, typically in those cases, was to give awareness to the content that was being procured independently by each of these different groups and allow for global purchasing, group-wide purchasing. Often that one savings, just that one thing, would more than pay for the deployment of a global LMS. Just that one piece. The other similar thing that would happen is the classroom training that was occurring was often being built by each business unit independently. And so again, you had duplication of effort, you had redundant content. The libraries would often have much more content than was necessary. I see this most often in Europe and Asia, where you have companies that are built via acquisition, and most of the business units have a lot of autonomy. They're run on a very decentralized basis. You see that much more often outside of North America than you see in North America. And as a result, massive savings were available if you were able to eliminate redundancy, because you would create that course one time instead of 10 or 20 times. It'd be much more cost effective. And so that's what's happened over the last 20 years. But something changed about 2 years ago. About 2 years ago, people woke up and realized that everybody is doing this stuff not at work on their PC, they're doing it on their mobile device. And so this is very apparent in the Indian market and in the Chinese market. It was far less apparent in the US market. And so these people had created massive training libraries over the course of 2 decades that suddenly were completely obsolete. So I had many meetings with CHROs and CIOs at North American companies who said, yeah, we understand, we're glad you have a mobile training app. Hopefully all our content will just play on that. We said, well, I have some bad news for you. Number one, if it were to play, it wouldn't look right or work right, because it would be a terrible experience for the student. But that's kind of irrelevant, because all that content that was developed over 20 years was developed in Shockwave and Flash, and it doesn't work on phones. And so essentially what you have is these massive e-learning libraries that essentially are obsolete. So you actually have an advantage here because in many cases you haven't built up those repositories of e-learning, and so you can build it the new way. You can build video-based content. And so the big change in learning today is a shift from flash-based, web-focused content to mobile video-based content. And that's going to happen very quickly. And so the way this is going to happen predominantly in the States and to a lesser extent in Europe will not be through the rebuilding of all of these content libraries. It's far too expensive and will take far too much time. What will happen is the growth of crowdsourced content, essentially user-generated content where people will use their smartphones to shoot videos of other people performing certain tasks. It might be a salesperson delivering a sales presentation. It might be a manufacturing employee using a particular type of equipment. It could be a maid at a hotel cleaning a room. And that video-based content will become the way that people replenish their e-learning libraries. So when we talk about development people, we see this massive shift, right? People want three things when it comes to development. So number one, they want transparency about their development. And this is particularly true with millennials. So with the new generation coming into the workforce. In the West, this is now 50% of the workforce. So essentially people under 30 in the workforce today. The reason is in the West, in the US, in particular in places like Germany and in Japan, you have a very small population of people, ages 35 to 50. It's actually a relatively small population of people. You have a large population of people who are over 55, and many of those people are now retiring. And in fact, in the US, you have this massive retirement wave where 40% of the workforce is retiring now. So this creates very interesting problems for a lot of companies, particularly in manufacturing, construction, and in the government. And so the new generation that's now entering the workforce has different requirements. They expect much more transparency in development, and they expect much more mobility in their jobs. They expect to be able to move from job to job. And so when we think about development, right, because you can now identify the high potential people, but when you're developing them, number one, you have to realize you're going to primarily be developing them on mobile devices. Number two, because it's on mobile devices, most of the training that is not in the classroom, and again, the majority of training will not be in the classroom, is going to be video-based, and therefore most likely will be user-generated. And number three, those people expect to have a lot of transparency about what training they're taking. And number four, they expect that training to be done socially. So their whole lives have been based on social networking, interactivity. And so when they go to a training program, particularly when we think about new hire induction or onboarding, or when we're talking about executive development, both types of training which often span not days or even weeks, but often months, you have an expectation that that cohort of people in the training is going to be collaborating together, that those people will be interacting together. And so they expect to be able to interact with the instructor, they expect to be able to interact with the other students in the program, and as a result, there's a very real expectation for social learning. And so development has changed dramatically. And then the last piece here is development, and it is retention. And so when we think about retention, it really comes down to two things. One is reward, right? How are people being rewarded? And there is a growing expectation, and I've talked to a lot of our multinational clients who have realized that their businesses have moved from one country to a global organization. You see this most often in places like Japan, China, and in Southern Europe, where the local market is no longer sufficient for growth. They have to go global. You see this acutely in places like Spain, where the local economy has collapsed and they're forced to go international to keep growing the business, or at least sustain the business. So what we're seeing is the expectation in these global environments that reward is based on performance. This whole idea of pay for performance, that people will be rewarded not based on how long they've been at the company, but based on how well they're performing. Now that, of course, goes back to the first point. How are you assessing your people? Because if you're paying for performance, the way you're assessing the people becomes incredibly important in how they're performing. The second piece of this is how transparent is the reward process. So how well does the employee understand what they're being rewarded, how their bonus has been calculated, what kind of long-term incentive they have, whether or not they're able to see or understand what kind of equity is offered or profit sharing is available to them, all become extremely important. The second piece of retention is this idea of mobility. So most companies have been organized based on a corporate ladder. Most management over the last 150 years is based on the idea that if I'm a manager and I have a good employee, my job is to keep that employee on my team, in my department. And again, when you think about the generation coming into the workforce, the expectation is exactly the opposite. The expectation is if I do well, I have mobility. We did a survey last year. How likely are you, or what is your preference to work in a different country? It was 76% of people said they wanted to work in a different country on average. What was really interesting about the survey, it was a global survey. So basically, it didn't matter where the people were, they all wanted to work somewhere else, no matter where in the world they were. And so this idea of being able to transition people around the world from place to place becomes extremely important. And the idea that as a manager, I'm going to keep my best people is passé at this point. We need to transition companies to the belief that the best people are going to move from different part of the organization to different part of the organization. And so this idea of system-wide succession planning that I talked about earlier becomes even more important as you think about the ability of people to be mobile in the organization. So being able to do this not just at the senior most level, but at a lower level in the organization to ensure that people are able to move from place to place becomes incredibly important, not just for the individual employee, but also for managers to accept the fact that I'm going to have to give up one of my best employees, but if I'm a good manager, I'm going to get another great employee. So change management becomes an incredibly important part of every CHRO's job. It becomes a very key job of HR departments around the world, trying to identify these people and allow the managers to be confident enough to let those people move into other parts of the organization. Because if it doesn't happen, and this is very acute in places like India, where the labor pool is very strong, where the market for laborers is very strong, especially skilled labor. And so you have an opportunity, if you're a good employee and you've done well and you have skills, if your company won't let you move to a different career or a different job or different division, I'll just go to a different company. And so the key driver of retention, I think, ultimately will be about mobility. Being able to identify the people, identify their career interests, and understand where they can be best placed in the organization. And that means breaking the framework of the corporate ladder. It means thinking about this idea of the corporate lattice, that a person can move from place to place across a wide net in the organization. And that's the way companies are going to be able to identify their top talent, to develop their top talent, and to retain it. So last point, why is this happening around the world today? Why has this become such a big deal? Why is talent management, or this whole concept, such an important around the world today? and in so much demand. And I think the reason is cloud computing. So there was an attempt to do all of this 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even 15 years ago with ERP systems. Right? There was the understanding that we need to do succession management, we need to have performance management, we need to manage compensation, we need to manage training and development. Let's build it into our ERP system. The reason that failed, the reason we've seen this massive shift globally in the last 10 years is very simply because of cloud computing and because of the fact that people move. People are not static. They're not widgets. It doesn't work like financial reporting. It doesn't work like supply chain management because people are constantly evolving. Companies are constantly restructuring. And so in an on-premise environment, it was simply cost prohibitive to keep these things maintained. Every time you had a reorganization, you would have to bring in a system integrator to redo all the systems that you had in place, rebuild all those organizational units, do a massive customization. Every time a person changed their competencies or their capabilities, every time a different model became important, a different process became important, it was incredibly difficult to change. Cloud computing enabled much more flexibility. And so the advent of cloud computing essentially enabled talent management. And that's why the first batch of successful cloud computing companies were talent management companies. They were focused on learning or performance or recruiting, but it was talent management enabled by cloud computing, which then in turn enabled cloud computing itself, because cloud computing became more scalable, it became more secure, and it became more configurable, which made it more cost effective and a real driver of growth. And so companies like us, Cornerstone today has 20 million users around the world, subscribers using our platform. The reason that's happened in 191 countries using the system in 42 languages is because talent management was enabled by cloud computing, and the growth of the company enabled us to solve those problems, solve the problems of scalability, solve the problems of security as we add more resources, more investment, more growth. And so this has become a very interesting market. There's been a lot of growth here, a lot of momentum, and I think will continue to be very interesting. So I hope to carry on the conversation with all of you. Thank you.